Welcome to the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Our mission is to help executives thrive as cyber risk managers. Your hosts are Kip Boyle, Virtual Chief Information Security Officer at Cyber Risk Opportunities, and Jake Bernstein, Partner at the law firm of K&L Gates. Visit them at cr-map.com and klgates.com.
So, Kip, what are we going to talk about today?
Jake, hey there. Well, it's kind of a gloomy topic, to be honest with you, but we need to do this. We need to explore it. And what we're going to talk about today is the convergence of cyber attacks and the loss of human life.
Well, that is dismal.
Yep, it is. But this is a time when I'm trying to actually take some of my own medicine, because in my book, Fire Doesn't Innovate, I talk about these kinds of exercises, and they're called negative visualization. And the idea is you can't just go around thinking about happy path all the time, right? You got to sometimes you have to stop, and you have to think about the threats that could be coming at you, and you want to get your arms around them before they become what I would call existential threats, right? So that's what today's podcast is about. It's about negative visualization.
Okay, well, I tell you what, you'll have to explain to me how this is different than threat modeling. But
Okay.
In the meantime, I shall reserve the right to call you Eeyore, the excessively pessimistic donkey, if you go too far with gloom and doom.
Nice Eeyore reference. That is the character that kind of pops up into my mind whenever I think about doing this kind of work. There's another character too, which I don't want to be. I don't want to ever be confused of being, which is Cassandra. I don't know if you know Cassandra, but that's in ancient Greek mythology. She's a somebody who does prophecy, and she tangles with one of the gods, and doesn't come out better for the experience. She gets cursed so that she can see the future, but that nobody will believe her prophecies, and she gets quite shrill in the
That would
story.
be frustrating to know that you're correct, but no one will listen to you.
Yeah.
So we don't want to be. Those are very different characters. We don't want to be either. So
No. Anyway, so thanks for keeping an eye on me. I don't want to be Eeyore either.
Yeah, no, and I don't think we are. I think that we tend to be pretty measured in our pessimism, which I think sometimes, as they say, if they're actually out to get you, you're not paranoid.
That's right.
And I think similarly here, I don't think we're being pessimistic. I think we're being realistic. And I think it's important to draw a distinction between, there's the rose-colored glasses of excessive optimism, which definitely I have worn from time to time. And you can be Eeyore, but I think in this case, we are unfortunately being realistic. So
I think so too. Yeah, but it's funny. I can tell you that in my attempts to be realistic and to practice negative visualization in a responsible way, I have on the job in the past been accused of being Eeyore and Cassandra at different times. So
I can see that.
Yeah, I mean, there's just some people who just don't want to hear any kind of negative talk at all, So if listeners, if you're working in the cybersecurity industry already, I got to think that you've had this experience before. And if you haven't, hang on, because I think it's inevitable. I think it's kind of a rite of passage.
Well, and it's, that's worrisome in some ways, right? Because I think being a Cassandra is no good. Being Eeyore is not great, but being a yes man is almost worse.
Yeah, sometimes though you have to do that to keep your job, and I don't know. I mean, the politics of the workplace, right, is sort of what's creeping into our conversation here. But that's not what I want the episode to be about.
Of course not. I agree. So, what will we be discussing then?
Yeah. So listen. So we're going to talk about again this intersection between cyber attack and human death. Now, originally, when I was preparing this episode, I was thinking that we would talk specifically about ransomware attacks on hospitals and how that has contributed to patient mortality, because there's actually some studies out there and a couple of news stories, which, we'll look at the news stories in a minute. But as I started doing the research and unpacking this, I actually found out that the situation is way more serious than I realized. And it wasn't because I didn't know about the other information, that I was retrieving. It's that I just hadn't put it, connected the dots, right?
Mhm.
So we're gonna connect those dots. I'm gonna share with you the dots that I connected as I was doing the research, and then towards the end of the episode, we'll talk about, okay, how bad could this get, and and so I think the title of this episode is going to be Killware. Believe it or not, that's the new turn of phrase. Have you heard that before?
Only in our discussion planning for this episode. It kind of reminds me. I mean, I think one thing that is not is, if you ever read like William Gibson Neuromancer, you may have heard of Black Ice,
Yep.
right? That's Killware of a different style. We're not there yet, but this is what I almost would call this murderware.
Yeah, possibly, or manslaughterware. I mean, it just depends, right? I mean, there's a legal dimension to this, which I'll touch on, but then there's just sort of the practical, getting through life aspect of it here. But let's go ahead and start digging in. So I was just looking at the past 2 years. I was just looking at cyber attacks, and I started with ransomware. And so let's go ahead and just start with a big cyber attack that happened in 2019, and that was the city of Baltimore in the state of Maryland here in the United States, right? And I'm not going to unpack all the details, but it was a pretty typical, although large-scale ransomware attack. It was, this is when ransomware really started to get large scale, and the city of Baltimore was really hung up in it. And I thought about it. Yeah, and I thought about it. I was like, okay, all right, what was the goal of the attack? Well, I think it was because the cyber attackers were trying to gain, right? They wanted money, and they were hoping that the ransom, would be paid. All right, so then how were they threatening the city? Well, it was a denial of service attack in a way, not the way we think of as far as like taking down websites and stuff, but really mass inconvenience for citizens, right? They can't access routine city services. So I was thinking, well, all right, so the idea is we're going to lock out the citizens, keep the city from doing business, and then they'll pay us money. And I think that's a good summation of what was going on there.
It is, and I think it feels like a good summation of in many cases, all forms of ransomware. The very, very basic goal is we're going to stop you from doing business by denying you access and service until you pay to unlock things. And there's lots of different ways, I think, to parse the mechanism that ransomware functions, but that's as good of a summary as any.
Okay, and I think that's an important data point, because notice in there, nowhere did I say Killware. I didn't say anything about death.
That's
right?
Pretty standard ransomware is what I would say.
Pedestrian almost.
Almost.
As we look back on it, although at the time I was aghast at the audacity to attack an American city of that size. I just thought, wow, that's really brazen, and it says a lot about how comfortable these people feel that they could do this. Okay, so now let's also look now at another data point. So there was an attack also in 2019. It was a ransomware attack, and we just found out about it because there was a lawsuit filed downstream from the attack, and the lawsuit was from a private party against Spring Hill Medical Center, which is located in Alabama. Now, what happened was, and I think we have to unpack this one a little bit, because I this is something that's just been recently revealed. But the medical center had a ransomware attack, and that did in fact impair their systems, and the hospital continued to operate. Inside the hospital, inside the neonatal intensive care unit, there was a child that was born that was in distress, and the baby was being monitored. Neonatal intensive care unit. If you've never been in there, that is like a little heaven on earth. The people in there are just angels, amazing people that just care for these very sick infants. And unfortunately, the child died. And the lawsuit says that it was they're alleging that it was due to a lack of vital signs monitoring that would typically be in place and would be monitored by the NICU nurses. But that system was one of the systems that was actually disabled by the ransomware. Now, in this case, whether it can be legally proven or not that the ransomware attack resulted in the death of this child, I don't know, and we won't know until things run their course. But I think it's fair to say that the goal was cyber attack a medical center because the attackers wanted money, same as Baltimore. The threat was, hey, massive inconvenience for staff and patients, right? Create some chaos and mayhem. And I don't know that the cyber attackers were trying to cause death, but I think it's reasonable that that there was a death. And I think it certainly had something to do with the ransomware attack. I don't know the causal relationship in the legal setting. I'll leave that for you and the other attorneys to kind of sort that out in court. But my point is okay, now we're starting to see ransomware attacks that have kind of this, byproduct of human harm.
Yeah, and I think with this one, I don't want to presume to ascribe motive or downstream thinking to the attackers, but I'm just going to, if I was a betting man, which I am not, but if I was, I would bet that the attackers in that situation, in the traditional layman's terminology, probably didn't intend to kill anybody.
Probably
right.
Not.
I think what they were thinking was a medical center is going to want to get its systems back online as soon as possible because it's important, and so if we lock it down, they should pay us quick, right?
Right.
And should they have maybe, I think, could they have reasonably foreseen that a death could result from a hospital ransomware attack? I think yes, but I think at this time in particular, my guess is that you're correct, and that this was intended to be along the same lines as the Baltimore ransomware attack and really any other ransomware attack. And one could even argue that the hospital should never have had these critical NICU monitors hooked up to a vulnerable data network.
Right.
I think and ultimately that may be the key to liability here, right? Because it's not like the hospital asked to be hit with a ransomware attack.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like the people are able to sue the ransomware attackers.
Right.
So, there's going to be, that's the legal question there. But in any event, I think it's clear that, this, and it's clear that it was a foreseeable byproduct of a ransomware attack.
I think so.
Now, I'm curious.
It's also showing that there's a convergence that's beginning here, right? Cyber attacks and human harm and human death.
Yep. Well, and I mean, what it is it's the convergence, or I would say that it's beginning to the cyber is beginning to bleed into the real world.
Mm-hmm.
Is what this is doing. So
yeah.
So still, though, I'm not sure that I would. I mean, if and I'm not sure where we're going to go exactly yet, because that's the fun of this podcast. But I'm gonna say at least that I'm not quite ready to proclaim that ransomware was actually Killware. Doesn't seem quite to fit.
I'd say that's true. But again, I'm connecting dots. So let me.
I got it. And I'm drawing the map.
Yeah. So let me give you the next dot. So in 2020, so just about a year ago, in Dusseldorf, Germany, Helios University Hospital suffers a ransomware attack, and it's very similar in concept, I think, to the Spring Hill Medical Center and countless other hospitals and medical centers that have had ransomware attacks directed at them. The difference here, though, which I think lines up with Spring Hill, is that there was a human casualty. And again, cause and effect and legality, I have to set that aside because I'm not involved in that. But I think here again in this university hospital, their systems were impaired because of this ransomware attack. The motivation was clearly financial gain for the attackers. I mean, there were ransom notes and negotiations, right? Just like in Spring Hill, just like in city of Baltimore, right? So it really fit the pattern But there was also a patient death. So there was a woman who was en route to the university hospital for emergency treatment, and the hospital told the ambulance that their emergency room was unavailable due to the system's failures, and so they advised the ambulance to route to another hospital, and the patient died en route. So, the government, right? So the local government in Germany, actually, the prosecutors investigated this as a potential homicide. Ultimately, they declined to prosecute because, and I don't know all the details of this, but they felt like they could not put together enough evidence to meet the legal standard in order to be able to prove murder or manslaughter or what have you. So I'll be interested to hear your comment on this one. But again, it's just another data point, and there's all kinds of other research here that shows that patient outcomes related to ransomware attacks are worse because of the attack than not. But here, somebody died again.
Yeah, and again, I think there's first of all, my caveat here is that I'm not much of a criminal lawyer. I took criminal law in law school, which is required, and that's about it. I'm not really familiar with the ins and outs of criminal law. But what I do know, at least in the US, is the concept of mens rea, which is the guilty mind, or the appropriate motive needs to be involved, because, just to take a classic, if you look down at the wrong moment and get into a car accident and somebody dies as a result, like, we don't call that murder, right? There's other words for it. It's manslaughter, or it's, negligent homicide and things like that. But the difference between Murder 1 and Murder 2, and everyone watches those shows, is intent, the malice aforethought, so to speak. And there's other terms out there like reckless endangerment. I think if you direct a ransomware attack at a hospital, at a minimum, there's not much doubt in my mind that you're recklessly endangering the lives of others, right? Is it murder? Whether I think it should be or not is kind of irrelevant. I think the reality is that it's unclear at this point, right? And again, I'm really curious to hear what you say, because even this one, which really is not that different at all from the Spring Hill Medical one, where we just said we probably wouldn't label that Killware. I'm still not sure that I'm ready to label this Killware. It's right. I could call it recklessly endangermentware, but that's a mouthful. I think again, the direct connection is a little tenuous, and that may be what the prosecutors in Germany were contending with. But and still, all of this, of course, is tragic. It feels avoidable, and it definitely feels as though the ransomware has played a part. I don't think we're not really saying that, but I guess what frightens me is that there's still dots to connect, and that there is an escalation that we're seeing. So
yes,
what's next?
Yeah. Okay, so the next one really isn't a ransomware attack per se, but it was a cyber attack, and it happened in early 2021. And it was against a water treatment facility in the town or city of Oldsmar, which is located on the west coast of Florida. It's a little north of the Tampa, St. Petersburg kind of metro area there. And so this was not a ransomware attack, but it was a cyber attack. What was interesting about this is that persons unknown, gained remote access to the critical controls, I'll say that, at the water treatment facility. And they actually was in the process of raising the levels of the amount of lye that was being introduced into the water supply. All right, so lye is commonly used to treat water to make it safe for drinking. So the presence of lye itself is not extraordinary. It's quite common, but it's got to be used at the right level. Too little lye and the water doesn't get sufficiently clean, but too much lye can actually cause skin burns. And if you drink water with too much lye in it, you're going to get severe internal injuries, right? You're going to burn basically your insides. And I can't imagine what it would be like. It would probably be very painful for an adult to do this, but for a child or an infant, to drink water with high concentrations of lye, I don't know, could be fatal. But however you want to classify this, I mean, I just don't see how you could interpret this cyber attack as anything less than an attempt to hurt people. And there was no evidence of any desire for financial gain. I mean, this was just how many people can we hurt? And the only reason that it failed is because this attack was attempted in broad daylight. It was done during working hours in the city of Oldsmar, and a technician saw the attack in process and stopped it. So I thought this was fascinating.
That sounds like a live fire test to me.
Yeah. And by the way, not a very sophisticated one either, because I think that this could have easily have been done in the dead of night in a much more silently. To me, this almost not only seems like a test, but it almost seems like a warning shot.
So, I mean, this feels like terrorism or enemy, or an act of war almost.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to classify this one as anything other than that. I mean, look, attacking a hospital with ransomware and shutting down its systems, I think I think once you know that somebody could die from that, doing it again is attempted murder. I think I think that it could rise to that level, right? I mean, if you're talking, if you want to do inconvenience people, go after the city infrastructure where
right.
It's super annoying, but the chance of somebody dying is quite low, and it's going to be random chance almost, right? Attacking a hospital, I mean, come on. I think at this point you should know that that's a realistic outcome. Attacking a water treatment facility with the express intent and action of increasing a caustic chemical level is nothing other than assault and truly attempted murder. So I think this, even though nobody died and even though it was caught, I think I would begin to classify this as a Killware, as an early attempt at Killware.
Right. Maybe a prototype.
It almost doesn't matter. It's deeply distressing because that there's, I mean, when the critical infrastructure is so connected and these types of things can be done remotely, I mean, for all the reasons that we have repeatedly mentioned on this podcast over nearly 100 episodes, how many times have we talked about the differences between the old style bank robbers who at a minimum have to put themselves in harm's way to physically enter a bank? You think about the equivalent, certainly poisoning a water supply is kind of an ancient concept of attack. It's hard, right? 'Cause you have to physically gain entrance. You have to contaminate. It has to go unnoticed. But this,
and you have to get out.
And you have to get out. This, on the other hand, it is for all the reasons that all the cyber attacks that we talk about are so difficult to stop. This is the same thing, and I think this is nothing other than a deliberate attempt to create chaos, damage a society, and hurt people.
Yeah.
So the fact that there was no detected financial component, I think makes this worse.
Yeah, I think so too. and I think that it probably wasn't automated, or maybe it was semi-automated. Because when I think of Killware, just like I think of ransomware or whatever, I think of a piece of software that does most of the heavy lifting for the attackers. And I don't think that what we saw here in the Oldsmar attack was automated very much. I think of it as a prototype because it could have been automated. I see no reason why it could not have been automated. So, okay, so there you go. So those are the dots that I found myself connecting, but it kind of went on. It kind of went on from there. Once I started seeing this term Killware, and I started reflecting on the Oldsmar attack. Well, then I put Killware in as a search term, and lo and behold, in October of 2021, which is only a few weeks prior to us recording this episode right now, the Department of Homeland Security in the United States actually came out and said that Killware is a real thing. And they actually did a press release and an interview, and they're actively promoting this idea that Killware is in our midst. And they kind of characterize it as the next line to be crossed in the cybersecurity threat landscape. And they're saying, look, there are some bold people out there who are willing to cause death and destruction, either to get money or simply to make a political statement. So
that's terrorism. That's the definition of terrorism.
And it's funny because I don't remember them using terrorism, that label in what I read, but I have no problem. I have no problem with that label.
Well, I mean, it's either terrorism or an act of war. And I think, speaking of an act of war, one thing that we have not discussed, and certainly we don't have nearly that much information, but I do remember hearing about. Well, I mean, we've talked about it before. I believe it was not Petya that was the kind of. I mean, I don't want to even call it ransomware because it really wasn't. It was just destructionware.
But it did present a false flag. It did actually drop ransom notices, but there was no way to actually take action on them. The information that provided was incomplete, erroneous, and so it was just this cover, this very thin cover.
But was it not Petya that targeted Ukrainian
businesses,
heating, or at least I'm not sure if it targeted it, but it affected the ability of the Ukraine to provide heat in the dead of Ukrainian winter, which, I mean, if that's not lethal, I'm not sure what is.
Well, that's another great example of this idea of Killware, right? Because
that's years ago.
Right, that was in 2017. So, but it happened in another country, right? And so, sorry, can't help it. We're very U.S. centric, right? And now it's come to the shores of the United States, right? Something that's happened in Ukraine, which was, hey, it's the dead of the winter. Let's pull people's heat. Of course, people are going to freeze to death, right? Some of the more vulnerable population is probably going to die. And now it's here. Now it's here in Oldsmar, Florida. And who knows how many other attempts have been made that didn't make it into the media, right? I mean, and we've talked about this, for every exploit that we hear about, it's a tip of the iceberg situation, right? 90% of what's really going on, we can't even see. So I've got to imagine that there's been other cases just like Oldsmar, but we just don't know about them yet, right? They're in the X-Files somewhere in a dusty warehouse.
Well, I think as one, this is probably one of our most depressing episodes of all time.
I said it was gloomy.
But we need to be realistic. And I think that one of the components of this is there are cyber weapons out there, right? They are that have the exact same design intention as a big old bomb, right? And they are developed by nation states. And the same concern that I think has always existed about nuclear proliferation is, what happens if criminals or terrorists get their hands on a nuclear weapon? For so many reasons, it is so much easier to obtain a cyber weapon, right? You're talking about some code, right? You're not talking about a radioactive hunk of metal with an incredibly sophisticated and complicated piece of machinery around it and the need to deliver that, right? You're talking about computer code. And
you're talking about Stuxnet, right? Let's go back to the Iranian nuclear uranium enrichment sabotage, right?
And,
I mean,
and that
perfect
was
example.
a cyber weapon as well. But and that's the thing about, and I don't want to get over, we don't need to necessarily dig too deep into this, but I think there's an important difference between a cyber weapon like Stuxnet, which had a incredibly specific target, right? I mean, this was a thing that literally was designed to make centrifuges go too fast, so they broke, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
That was the goal of Stuxnet. It's that's a laser scalpel level of cyber weapon, right? And that's
although
concerning.
It could easily have been worse than that, right? Because
it could have.
It could have been designed to cause the centrifuges to explode, and that would have killed people.
It could have, and I think that is. I think that's where I'm kind of going, is that, and that was I believe years ago.
2017.
Stuxnet was also 2017.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
2017 was a big year.
It was a big year. Yeah.
Massive
but
cyber.
I think what we're saying is that, you've said it before, where we're all, what's your one of your phrases? We're all foot soldiers in the cyber war, right? We've been saying that for years now, but it's becoming distressingly real.
Yeah, it is.
To the point where,
I'm sorry, I have to correct myself. Stuxnet was actually 2010, not 2017.
Okay, that's what I thought. I thought it was. I thought it was much longer ago.
It was 2010, which makes it even worse.
Yes, it was much longer ago. So, I mean, you would talk about a prototype. That was one of the original. Let's see if this is even possible, and they proved that it was.
Well, and even before Stuxnets, there was actually a publicly released experiment called Aurora, where they had this big diesel generator out in Idaho, and they remote attacked it, and they actually, through remote means only, actually caused the generator to run out of spec and self-destruct. So, I mean, that was just a proof of concept,
Well, and I think, I think what we need to be wary of, and I think let's use the phrase cyber risk management here on the Cyber Risk Management podcast, is what we all need to be aware of is that, next time there's a geopolitical, call it what you will, I'm just going to say a war, the being across, having two oceans on either side of the U.S. is no longer enough to necessarily insulate us from direct attack. No. And that's a sobering thought that I think must be considered by everybody who touches upon infrastructure in this country. And, that means that's cities, that's states, but that's also a lot of private industry. And if we think about, the pandemic, I think has in many ways done us all a type of weird service, insofar as really laid to bear the risks posed by supply chain disruption. We all remember, there's places that it was hard to find food because the supply chains were all out of whack. And I don't think it requires much imagination to imagine how even a so-called regional conflict could result in the launch of cyber weapons that are designed to severely disrupt civilian life. And that's a sobering thought. It's awful.
I think about this new battlefield, right, which you're describing. In the 1960s and 1970s, the greatest threat was nuclear annihilation from intercontinental ballistic missiles. And it took roughly 30 minutes from the time that a missile was launched on one side of the Earth until it could actually strike its target on the other side. And so we built all these early warning launch detectors, satellites and radar and backscatter over the horizon things. Well, now that same distance can be traversed with electrons in the form of packets on the network in milliseconds. There is no early warning for this kind of stuff. I don't see how it's possible. So
There's not.
it's really different. It absolutely has transformed, the speed at which, weapons can be delivered, and weapons of mass destruction, as it turns out, not just
Yeah,
weapons of mass irritation.
there is one difference though that I think is critical that I want to really highlight in this episode, which is, when that nuclear missile is launched, there's not much that can be done about it at that point, right? Maybe you can intercept it, right? Maybe
Star Wars, right?
Right, Star Wars. But when it detonates, you're dealing with irreducible laws of physics there, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think what's different about what we're talking about now, the cyber weapons, the cyber attacks, is that in fact we have the ability now, before they are launched, to blunt their effectiveness, right? In a way that is not possible with
that's a good point.
Nuclear or conventional weapons. We have to choose to be vulnerable by our inaction.
Yeah.
And I think that, look at the hospitals is a good example. It's awful what happens there. But I think that there should also be outrage directed at those institutions for allowing themselves to be in that position in the first place. Because I don't want to victim blame. I don't want to shame the victim.
Thank you. I don't either, but they do have a responsibility, right? I mean, they're not just individuals who are only looking after themselves, right? They're entrusted with the care of citizens, right? They have a duty, and that's really what we're trying to focus on. They have a duty of due care, right? Isn't there a legal standard here around that?
There are many legal standards, and the thing about it too is that so many of these network vulnerabilities are things that we've created because it made something slightly easier on someone, right? A gain of a small convenience. Mm-hmm. And I think about that, and I think about the risk that it creates, and it just begins to feel less and less
worth it,
justifiable in the long run to not correct these mistakes.
Yeah. So
and I'm not blaming.
Yeah. I want to springboard off that, because you just said something really important, which is, we're trading off convenience for these increased risks. And I want to now turn our discussion, as we wrap up the episode, towards the future, right? So if Killware is a thing, what does that say about our future? And so I think the first thing we need to do is I need to bow to your legal need to define everything, right? Because that's really important. If we're going to talk about the future, I think we need to be really clear on what the definition of Killware is. So I'm going to offer a definition. I think it's the malicious targeting and exploitation of the interconnectedness of critical aspects of everyday life for the express purpose of causing individuals serious physical harm or death. What do you think about that?
I think that's a good definition. I might rephrase the ending as death or severe bodily harm, because that tends to be what the statutes always say when they talk about these things.
Bodily harm.
Severe bodily harm is the death or severe bodily harm tends to be the phrase.
Okay.
But no, it's the same thing. And we're talking about electronic medical devices, obviously, infrastructure, transportation networks. I mean, look, there is literally no other purpose for messing around with the stoplights than to cause an accident and snarl traffic with people's, and there's, you don't have to be even slightly imaginative to understand how that could cause a death, right?
Mm-hmm. I did a presentation recently. That's actually a couple of years ago for a bunch of insurance professionals, because they were wondering, like, self-driving cars, oh my gosh, it's going to decimate the automobile insurance industry, because, if it takes off, then the number of private vehicles needing insurance is going to drop. And so they invited me to come and talk to them about, what would be the impact of self-driving cars to their industry. And so as I started unpacking it, one of the things that I realized is that part of the visioning for self-driving cars isn't just that they'll drive themselves using their own sort of sensors and that sort of thing, but that they'll actually talk to big city transportation infrastructures and will receive commands from them. So if you've ever driven down an interstate during high traffic, high congestion, here in Seattle, we actually have smart signs that will change the legal speed limit depending on the congestion. And so that's one example of something we have in place now. But in the future, the vision is that big city transportation infrastructure would actually issue those commands to the cars directly. So in other words, they wouldn't just change a sign and depend on a driver observing that new reduced speed limit. It would actually tell the self-driving car, hey, reduce your speed to 35 miles an hour because there's a big traffic jam coming up. Well, what if instead of saying reduce your speed to 35 miles an hour, that message gets hacked, and the self-driving car, it receives a message that says increase your speed to 65 miles an hour because the road ahead is clear. And what do you get, right? So and you haven't even hacked the car, you've hacked the transportation infrastructure. And why do we do all this? Because we want the convenience of not driving ourselves around. And I just think it's a great example of what you were talking about. And by the way, episode 22 of the Cyber Risk Management Podcast, I looked this up, March 19th, 2019, we talked about the cyber risks of autonomous vehicles. So if that sounded familiar to some of our longtime listeners, it's because I actually dipped my hand into the archive.
Yeah. And that this is such... to me, this is actually critical risk management, this discussion, and the fact that it's uncomfortable and maybe depressing is really kind of, maybe it's beside the point, or maybe that is the point, but we cannot shy away from these types of discussions. If we're going to seriously consider these new technologies and these new, we have to understand that they come with new vulnerabilities and new risks. And do we want to take those risks?
Yeah, big, senior decision makers have an aversion, I have noticed, to participating in this gloomy type of exercise that we're conducting right now. But I agree with you. It's absolutely critical that some amount of the energy being focused towards doing these things needs to be allocated to these kinds of negative visualizations. And it's really not all that different from threat modeling, Jake, which you asked me about in the beginning of the episode. It's really not all that different from it. I think the basic idea is the same. We don't really have the same kinds of frameworks, right? That software threat modeling has, like Stride and so forth. But we certainly do need them. Okay, we're continuing to wrap up the episode. This has been a great conversation, but I think we're in danger of going long. So one other question that I want to pose and then try to answer, which is, how bad will this get? I think that's a very, very reasonable thing for us to ask. So as I did that research, guess what? Gartner, the IT research firm, which is widely respected and considered to be an authority on its ability to make predictions. In fact, when they make a prediction, they will almost always qualify it with a percentage. They'll say 60% chance that this is going to happen and so forth. And Gartner projects that within the next 4 years, cyber attackers will be weaponizing operational environments specifically for the purpose of harming and killing people. They're estimating that Killware attacks will cause fatalities that will reach $50 billion per year in the next 4 years. And they also are predicting that government and public reaction to these crimes, and I think it's reasonable to call them crimes, will lead to CEOs being held personally accountable for cyber attacks in which physical harm or death occur. So that is not some fringe blogger here making those predictions.
Well, and I mean, I don't know that we're going to. I mean, I think a lot of people have been saying for quite a long time. I mean, there's books, right? Click Here to Kill Everybody by Bruce Schneier. There's many, many books that have talked about this. We discuss with the author of, by the time you read this, it will be too late. There's all, this is not, then just read science fiction. I mean, none of this is like, you don't even need a Terminator, right? To go and Skynet to go bad, to fear these types of things and to be aware of them. But the thing is that, we need to take them seriously because they're preventable.
Yeah.
None of this is destiny. We can make choices.
The fate is
now.
what you make. What is it? How's that go? John Connor, the fate is
yes.
Is what you make, or something like that. Anyway, that's what I'm hearing right now in my brain as I hear you talk. So it is preventable, unlike ballistic missiles. I like that. That's a key insight, I think, for our listeners.
And I mean, we need to, I mean, I always have to inject a bit of optimism to go along with pessimism. But again, I think this is not, but again, I want to be clear. This is not pessimism. This is realism, right?
Right.
This is,
Yep.
These are things that have happened and will happen. And we have to decide, whether or not, look, let me rephrase the point here is that avoidance of death and severe bodily harm is, throughout the business world is kind of it's a key concept. And you want to know why? Is interestingly enough is that if you go through international law, and even US law, and you look at all these different contracts, what you will find is that almost without fail, you cannot avoid liability for death or severe bodily harm via contract. It's not, it's just one of those things that for either public policy or common law has been found to be untenable. And that's good, right? We don't want someone to be able to waive your right to recovery because they, on these types of real serious issues. And what's going to really change the scope of awareness around cybersecurity, which still to this day, look, it's you and I can gnash our teeth and stamp our feet all we want about how obvious and how important this is, but there are still a lot of people who see it as an IT problem that's an inconvenience at best.
Yes, or don't even see it at all.
Or don't even see it. That will not hold when people die from cyber attacks. It will not.
It's awful. And it's awful that people have to die in order to create the kind of care. But you know what? I've seen it happen before in other disciplines having nothing to do with IT. So it wouldn't be the first time. Okay, Jake, I'm convinced that Killware is a thing, which is awful. But are you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, not only is it a thing, it's a thing that I think it's, I think people, the awareness of it creates, the seeds of liability are being planted now. You have to take action now.
Okay, so let's end on a positive note. What can we do about this? Well, we've kind of talked a little bit about the fact that it is preventable, right? But let me just sort of give a synopsis, okay? Now, listen, Killware, even though the intent, right, is to harm people, at the end of the day, Killware is like ransomware in the sense that it depends on a successful phishing attack in order to gain a foothold, or it depends on the exploitation of a missing patch, right? Because there's a vulnerability or a compromised account or whatever. It pretty much all starts the same way. So the best defense, I think, is good cyber hygiene. We've talked about that on the podcast. I talk about that in my book. And I specifically continue to believe in the power of the Essential 8, which is it's just a very recently published framework of 8 controls that are designed specifically to stop account stealing and to stop malicious code infections, or to render them inert to think about a bomb going off. What I also love about the Essential 8 is that they modify those 8 controls every time they feel like the landscape has changed and they need to keep up with it, which I really appreciate. And that contrasts tremendously with a lot of other things that people use to be proactive, right? There's lots of other frameworks and things that you can use that are not changing nearly as often to keep up. So I like the Essential 8. It's from the Australian Signals Directorate, and I think they've transferred control of it over to another Australian government entity. But I really believe in them, and I think if you don't know what those are, members of our audience, I think you should go out there and do a little bit of research, and they're incredibly practical. And I think if you want to get ready for Killware, I think this is something that you should be doing.
Yeah, and I think we'll see a surge in the use of ASICs, application specific integrated circuits. An older idea. In a way, it's the opposite of general computers, general purpose computers, and they are but when something
more like
does one thing, and that's literally all it can do, it's a lot harder to hack it.
That's absolutely true. And the Essential 8 kind of talks about that when they start talking about application control or application allow listing, which I think that's the future. I know a lot of IT people think that, we used to call this application whitelisting, was an administrative nightmare that they wanted no part of. I get that, but man, the stakes are just going too high, I think, to to continue to have that kind of an aversion. All right, Jake, any other comments before we wrap it?
No, I think we're good.
I think we've talked this one to death.
I think so to speak. Bad pun there, Kip.
Oh my gosh. Well, listen, folks in the audience, if you think we have missed anything, let us know. Send us an email, drop us a note. We hang on to LinkedIn, and you can send us messages through the Cyber Risk Opportunities website. But for now, that wraps up our episode. And today we went into the gloomy and depressing talk about Killware, although we see it as an absolutely necessary exercise in negative visualization so that we don't get caught up in a existential crisis. And we're glad you were here, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Thanks for joining us today on the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. If you need to overcome a cybersecurity hurdle that's keeping you from growing your business profitably, then please visit us at cr-map.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.